And it was encouraging to hear the praise that you outlined that clearly was a result of the 2017 budget, where we put in those structural reforms that stopped our state from just spending any revenues that come in and actually require some fiscal discipline and paying off our debts and controlling our spending level. I wanted to just get some clarification on the revenue growth side. We heard some comments earlier that this is maybe a historic level of revenue growth for our state. But what I thought I heard you say, and Secretary McCaw, this may have been from you, both of you may have mentioned this, is that the revenue growth is really attributed to the federal grants that the state has received. In addition, the sales and use tax. And the sales and use tax, I understood, attributed to two things in terms of the growth. One was, again, federal money, the stimulus money that put more money into our economy. So there was greater sales tax revenue. And the second really being inflation. So the increased costs have resulted in increased sales and use tax. We're certainly seeing that at the gas pump. We're seeing it across the board. Is that correct? Is there something else missing? Because it seems that we'd really be in a deficit right now if it wasn't for these unprecedented one-time receipts that we're seeing.
So Representative Devlin, a lot of that is in fact true. There are a couple of areas that I would just nuance a bit. As we look at overall general fund revenue growth in fiscal year 22, we saw about 5% across all of our revenue sources. In fiscal year 23, we project 2.4%. Some of that improvement was we had a tough year in 20 and 21 because of the pandemic. Industries were closed. We did see some revenue sources that took a hit. So we are playing catch up. We also know that the amount of money the Fed's infused into our economy contributed to, as you said, consumer confidence, additional spending. You see that in the sales and use receipts. We also saw withholding hold on stronger than we have previously seen in prior economic downturns. The amount of unemployment income that was available, it was a broader set of individuals, including business owners, et cetera, that benefited from this. We would have thought we would have seen a heavier hit to withholding. So yes, the federal resources were a lifeline to the state of Connecticut. And I think our success in mitigating COVID, reopening industry, building consumer confidence is allowing us to see that sustained. We will have to monitor without these resources if we're able to maintain these trends. And for that reason, OPM and OVA, I think we use a good amount of conservatism to ensure that the trend will continue. The biggest challenge, I think, for us will be in fiscal 24 when we remove those temporary revenue sources that allowed us to achieve balance. And it was good for the time frame, right, to bring stability to the state at a time when we need to see industries recover. The question ultimately will be, will we see growth, economic growth, translated into tax receipts that will help to replenish the $1 billion that we temporarily use to balance our budget? And so that, that will remain to be seen. That's the caution of what 24 looks like. The positive is that as you go beyond that, at least we're starting to see that the new fixed cost growth and the new revenue growth coming in is more in alignment.
So I appreciate that. And I think it's important as well, to your point, that there are positive things like our ability to pay off our pension debts and to bring those liabilities down, which will help us longer term, but that we're also painting a realistic picture. While we might be in a positive position right now because of all of this infused money, it really isn't a reflection of the health of our overall economy, as you pointed out, with the deficits that we'll be seeing come 2024. So that's kind of tied to Rep. Nuccio's question. I just wanted to get some greater clarity around that as well. That is that gap. What I heard you say earlier in your presentation multiple times was that there'll be a need for increased revenue sources because there will be this $1 billion gap, which rather than $1 billion potential tax increase, or maybe they'll just be organic growth, which would be wonderful. Is the gap the result of using those one-time sources essentially for operating costs? Or is it, or maybe you could break it out even by buckets in that sense. Is it covering one-time operating costs, or how much is that? Is it, to the point Neil was just making, some groups have been getting extra money, and I hope the message with that extra money is that it isn't necessarily sustained. Maybe we'll be able to. But is there also new programs that have been put in place that are essentially sort of like we're seeing at a federal level, right? We'll just do it for 1 year when it maybe should be a longer term, but are there new programs that have been put in place that are requiring funding now, that those also are at risk of not having funding long term? So to simplify that, if I kind of jumbled that up a bit, looking at that deficit going forward, were those monies where we're going to see the gap? Is it due to that we were spending on operating costs, so that's going to be the gap? Is it just additional payments that others have gotten to get them through the pandemic? Or is it new programs that have been established that may require some longer term funding?
So Representative Devlin, it's a mixture, right? We knew at the time when this budget, the governor was presenting his budget, and at the time the legislature was adopting a budget, that there was uncertainty about the economy as businesses were being reopened, industries were being reopened, and whether or not and how soon we would see revenues rebound. And principally, this budget acknowledged that we needed to provide adequate time to see how Connecticut's economy responds in what we thought would be a post-COVID, but certainly it's going on a little bit longer. And so, yes, part of the structural issue is the use of one-time revenue. On a positive note, you're seeing some outperformance in revenue. The question is, will it continue to outperform, driving down that structural deficit? Thirdly, the use of ARPA for recurring costs. I think it's important to talk about the types of expenditures. We had a nursing home strike. We had concerns about the health and safety of vulnerable residents across the state that had to be addressed. This was a session that was heavily focused on equity for the workers and ensuring that they have wages they can live off of. We had a group home strike. We had those vulnerable clients that we needed to address, long-term having the security of workers to take care of them. And then we had some pressures from our private providers. So as we look at the types of things that were funded with one-time dollars, there, the nursing homes, the group homes, there were critical needs there. Yes, that does exacerbate the challenge. It does increase the amount that we're going to have to fund. And as Director Ayers noted, then there are other things that were discretionary in nature. We put a lot of investment into the communities because we felt coming out of the pandemic, they needed those investments. They don't necessarily have to be recurring. Those are the types of decisions that you will make in the next year plus to come. And that could mitigate the size of the gap. Is there a problem in fiscal 24? Yes, there is. The size of it will depend on the level of economic growth, whether revenues outperform, and how much of these temporary investments we want to become permanent. So remains to be seen, but the challenge is certainly there for fiscal 24 and begins to improve beyond that.
Right. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I hate to, stick a needle in the bubble of, great news on our current fiscal state, but I do think it's really important that we're realistic and understand what some of the fundamental things are that are just covered over. So thank you.